Failures by state and local law enforcement, highlighted by a federal report on the Uvalde school shooting.
It's got the DOJ stamp of approval, so now people might listen.
We hear from families after the release, why for some it's raising new hope for answers and accountability. Ken Paxton says he's done fighting the whistleblower lawsuit against his office. The legal maneuver could keep him from testifying under oath, but the judge in the case has a different idea. And can anyone challenge Donald Trump in Texas? Our poll looks at what voters think of the top races for Republicans and Democrats as we get closer to the primary.
Produced from the Capitol in Austin and airing statewide, this is the award-winning State of Texas.
Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm Josh Hinkle. Police officers who responded to the school shooting in Uvalde missed numerous opportunities to change their response, and that cost lives. That's one key finding of a report released Thursday from the U.S. Justice Department. It's the most comprehensive federal review of the deadly shooting at Robb Elementary. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland traveled to Uvalde to deliver the report and spoke directly to families of the victims.
I told them that the priority for the Justice Department in preparing this report has been to honor the memories of those who were taken from them. And I told the families gathered last night what I hope is clear among the hundreds of pages and thousands of details in this report. Their loved ones deserve better.
The report looked into what caused officers on scene to wait 77 minutes before taking down the gunman who killed 19 children and 2 teachers. Much of the DOJ report covered things we've already heard, like that delay and communication problems among first responders, but there are some new details. Investigator Dalton Huey has been scouring through the report. What did you learn?
So yes, like you said, there was a lot of information in there that we were previously aware of, but there were a lot of details that were associated with not just the incident, but the minutes, days, months afterwards that ultimately have continued to be problematic today.
You've posted a lot of those details online in your story. Can you tell us about some of the key points that you focused on?
Yeah, so we focused on the failure to set up a incident command center. It was emphasized a lot in the report. It talked about the fact that there was just no leadership there that was taking action like they should have been, citing actually 2 of the officers' leadership positions who had the training necessary to do it, and they just didn't. On top of that, we focused on the crime scene, being contained and being established the way it should have been to prevent any contamination of the evidence. The FBI offered their assistance to DPS and they refused. As a result of that, a large storm came in. The evidence was not maintained properly, and it contaminated all of that evidence, and it cited, weapons, ammunition, personal materials that were all lost as evidence to the crime. And then in addition to that, we talked about the impact that the families of the victims had and how they were treated afterwards. It took 4 days for there to be any Spanish communications to them in the first place. The report even cited the FBI at fault at one point because the child victim interviewees had no cultural connection to the children, which is by protocol supposed to be happening.
Yeah, I can imagine it was difficult with the Spanish language thing, especially because that community has so many primarily Spanish speakers as their first language. What else stuck out to you in the report?
The FBI offered assistance multiple times to DPS. They declined twice, the second time being with victim assistance and victim interviews for death notifications. They were trained in that. DPS were not. On top of that, the fact that law enforcement, local and federal, are still delayed because DPS is refusing to cooperate with the evidence that they seized, and that's why we are here, over a year later, and some investigations haven't even started.
All right, Dalton Huey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Families of the children killed at Robb Elementary heard the findings of the report hours before it was released to the public. For some, it raises new hope for answers and accountability. Our Monica Madden spoke to families in Uvalde. They tell us they hope the report helps fuel their fight for justice.
It's hard.
Jerry Mata's family will never be the same. His daughter Tess was one of the 21 lives taken during the May 2022 shooting at Robb Elementary.
People don't know the pain that it causes.
Since the shooting, the Matas and other victims' families have sought answers and accountability for law enforcement response that day.
It's got the DOJ stamp of approval, so now people might listen.
Brett Cross's son Uzziah wanted to be a police officer, making the way he died even more painful.
It's frustrating that, he was felled by the same career that he wanted to do.
Lives would have been saved and people would have survived.
U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland outlined the DOJ's extensive review Thursday, noting numerous occasions where police could have changed their response, like gunshots heard, repeated 911 calls from a student inside, and reports a teacher had been shot.
As a consequence of failed leadership, training, and policies, injured and scared students and teachers remain trapped with the subject in the classrooms, waiting to be rescued.
The family's calls for consequences for the leaders who failed still left unanswered.
Well, I'm going to leave that question for the DA. The Justice Department only has criminal jurisdiction where federal crime has occurred.
That it's something that we've been saying this whole time, but it was really good to hear somebody in that position, finally be like, yes, children could have been saved.
Haunting families in Uvalde, where their time stands still.
It just hurts. It breaks your family, it does.
Monica Madden, State of Texas.
Many of the facts outlined in the DOJ report had already been uncovered by Texas lawmakers. In the weeks immediately after the mass shooting, a House investigative committee issued a report on the shooting and the response. State Representative Joe Moody was the vice chair of that committee. Thank you for joining us today, Representative.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to get your thoughts on the report. Do you feel that the feds had access to more information or uncovered any new details?
Well, look, it's a 600-page report, and it's one that I've been able to go over, during the last 24 hours. I don't see any major contradictions with the investigative report that we issued in the weeks following this horrific tragedy. They certainly were able to have access to federal agents, which we did not have access to, and certainly I think built upon the work that we did ultimately.
The DOJ report highlighted failures in how law enforcement gave information to families in the hours and days after the shooting. The failures included a lack of information released in Spanish and death notices delivered by undertrained personnel and insensitive leadership. Is that something you found when investigating the response as well?
Yes, absolutely. That was something that we had uncovered as well. I do agree with the DOJ's assessment about how the information flowed during the days, weeks, and months after that horrific shooting. Certainly, we heard stories about how some of the death notifications were given at the reunification center. You and I would both hear those stories and would, I think the only way we could describe them is callous. I wouldn't say that was intentionally done that way, but the problem was there was not a lot of coordination. You didn't have the right people in the right place delivering. There's no right way to deliver such terrible information to people who have lost so much. But it certainly could have been better, should have been better, and that was one of the issues that we weren't able to really delve into fully in our report. But we certainly heard from some of the family members about the lack of care, lack of compassion, and some of the real re-traumatizing events that took place in the wake of that tragedy.
Well, we have the DOJ report on top of the Texas House report, as you mentioned. Do you think there will be accountability for that 77-minute delay before stopping the shooter? What needs to happen next?
Well, I think there were a number of things that we did in this past legislative session regarding training, but I think some of the major takeaways from the DOJ report were how these agencies that are, from the smallest school district police department to the federal government could have done better in coordinating their efforts, could have done better in figuring out who was in control, who was in command. My hope is that with this more detailed report on top of our report, we're going to be able to continue to work on ways to better prepare for incidents like this, because quite frankly, until we do something about the epidemic in this country of mass shootings, we're going to continue to have to confront these types of situations. And so if we're going to continue to confront them, whether it be in El Paso, Sutherland Springs, Dallas, Santa Fe, Uvalde, that they be done better, that we were able to care for people in their darkest hour.
All right, State Representative Joe Moody, thank you for joining us. The Texas Attorney General makes a move to end the whistleblower lawsuit against his office. Why it could keep Ken Paxton from testifying under oath. The Arctic blast fueled record demand for electricity in Texas, but can the grid meet the state's growing need for power? What the grid operator is doing to prepare for the future. And the Texas primary is closing in fast. Why Democrats are unsure about who they want to run against Ted Cruz.